Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Pedro Conceição. I'm the head of the Human Development Report Office at UNDP. And I only want to welcome all of you to this symposium on inequality in the 21st century. Inequality is going to be the topic for this year's Human Development Report. Inequality is something that the Human Development Report has looked at for many years. In fact, the very first report said that inequality was a central issue, but didn't say much more beyond that because the report said there was no data available. But over the last few years, there's been really a revolution in the availability of data. Many innovations have taken place that are making their way now into the world of academia, policy making, the public at large. And we just had a 1.5 symposium on inequality measurement. It's more interesting than it sounds, I think, right? And we are privileged to have a partnership with World Inequality Lab and with the Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality, UNU wider, and jointly with them, these are really the leaders of this movement of innovation on inequality measurement. We thought that we should not keep the discussion to a closed group of people and should really have an open dialogue. So that's what we're here to do, and we want to obviously look at measurement, but looking beyond that and try to understand why inequality matters today and perhaps more importantly, what to do about it. And to moderate the dialogue and to get us started, I'll invite UNDP Administrator Achim Steiner. Achim?
Good afternoon, colleagues. Welcome to this slightly discotheque-like setting, but it is probably not inappropriate for a discussion about inequality because so often these discussions happen not quite in the broad spotlights of our public policy, but have sort of been coming up on us from perhaps below and unexpected quarters. So forgive us perhaps for a slightly different setting, but there's always a lot happening in this United Nations headquarters building, especially today also with our peacekeepers, and therefore, Pedro, thank you for finding a place in which we could meet. As we were walking here, I asked Pedro, so how did the seminar or the symposium go? And I've never seen him quite as excited. I looked at him, only you could become so emotionally excited about a seminar or the symposium on measurements of inequalities. So first of all, to all of you who have participated in this, thank you for making time. We meet here today both against the backdrop of what inequality, in its broadest sense of the word, is causing us all, which is a great deal of disquiet in many of our societies, triggering a great deal of polarization, a questioning of fundamentals, whether it is the social compact, whether it is the role of government, whether it's the role of capital, and so on. And for us in the United Nations, perhaps not surprisingly, but nevertheless, interestingly, in congruence with the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, it's actually a universal issue. It's not a developing country issue. It's not an industrialized country issue. It is actually an issue that permeates virtually every country, not necessarily in the negative, but as a preoccupation in the way that societies choose to live together, in the way that they choose to empower government and governance to play a role, in the way that we license our governments to tax in order to invest in our common good or in some of the drivers that we will discuss this afternoon that can actually address the issue of inequality. Now, somebody recently said to me also, actually, you know, I don't actually believe that inequality is the right word for what we're dealing with. And perhaps this afternoon, we don't have to spend too much time debating the nomenclature because in the broad sense, we're at a point where we know that there are a number of things that are simply out of sync in a kind of disequilibrium that socially, politically, economically is manifesting itself in many ways. But the point that she was making to me is it may be more the issue of access and equity. Is that another way of understanding why inequality has become such a provocation in our societies? And, you know, this morning I was reading again the statistic that, you know, if you fill half a New York metro bus with people, you have in one bus the equivalent of 3.8 billion people in terms of wealth accumulation. That is the Oxfam statistic. 26 people owning the equivalent of the wealth of 3.8 billion people. That's almost 4 times the total population of the continent of Africa. It's sometimes useful, and we can debate, is it 26, is it 29, or is it 42? It doesn't really matter. The order of magnitude is just mind-boggling. And it translates itself into a much more mundane reality. In fact, Paul was just showing me the statistics of how wage and labor productivity essentially have, in recent years, become divorced from the way that a worker would partake in increased productivity. I've forgotten the exact number you had just now. I'm sure you will speak to it, but I remember also in the industrialized world, the developing world, the developed world, a statistic is roughly 16% increase in labor productivity, but only a 6% increase, equivalent increase in wages paid out. That means more than half of that extra productivity is going to very few people. Now you might say, well, that's how it is in our modern world. It's capital that counts, it's technology, it's the infrastructure that determines a business ability to earn money. That may be so, but clearly it is not necessarily a viable social compact within which to define not only our economies, but actually how we want to live with one another in an economy of the 21st century. We have also invited you here, and I'm very pleased to see also my colleagues from the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, Elliot, Navid, and others, because across the UN, obviously, we are preoccupied with this issue of inequality. We are working it from many different angles. The particular perspective in which we, at the moment in the United Nations Development Programme, are approaching this is twofold. One, virtually every government is looking across the world for inspiration, ideas, and approaches to address inequality in a way that does not distort the opportunities for development, that does not create other diseconomies of public policy, if I may refer to them in those terms, and that above all allow them to both retain the confidence of their population while being able to operate in a global economy that, particularly if you're a developing country, a smaller developing country, a poorer, smaller developing country, the outlook at the moment is very tough. And that also has to do with the advent of technology, of entirely new platforms that did not exist 10 years ago and today dominate a market for services. You know the examples very well. We are rewriting the methodology with which we want to help the world understand poverty, inequality, human development in the context of the 21st century. UNDP, well over 2 decades ago, created a landmark discussion around the Human Development Report, the Human Development Index, by broadening it beyond income. And we are today also looking at income as a fundamental reference point. Lucas, great to have you here from the World Inequality Lab. But also saying it's beyond income. And that's not saying income doesn't matter. On the contrary, it is critical, but it is not the only way to understand poverty. We all know that. The Multidimensional Poverty Index, the work that many of us have been part of, has tried to address this already, but frankly speaking, the Human Development Index, the UN's Human Development Report, is in need of a makeover, not just in terms of the way it looks, but in fact in the way that it offers the world a way on reflecting on its own outcome of development decisions. We want to do that against the backdrop of both knowledge, the knowledge frontier, the discovery of success in policy and in government and in public choice, but also in understanding how factors such as climate change, that sustainability, environmental dimension will define some of the parameters into the future that simply were not on the radar screen of the last 100 years. It is an epochal effort, an ambitious project, but one in which we count on many of you to view the Human Development Report as a vehicle, not only to express, identify, and articulate a contemporary way of looking at human development, of how countries can pace and measure themselves, but also hopefully to contribute to the ability of leaders in our societies, be they from the civil society, the private sector, or government, to exercise wiser choices that allow our societies not to fall apart over what should actually be a success, generating more wealth, more income, more economic activity. But clearly, at the beginning of the 21st century, that simplistic formula is not holding. And that's why we are here, and that's why I'm so grateful that we have a fantastic panel here. And I want to begin by introducing Paul Krugman, who does not need introduction. In many ways, Paul, you have been both through your work as an economist, through your columns, through your public policy engagement, also an expression of the very search that we are trying to also capture in some of the rethinking about the Human Development Report here. So let me begin by inviting you to address the meeting. Thank you for being with us, and welcome.
Hey. Well, thanks. Thanks all for having me here. All right, I think in some ways I'm the grand old man here. I'm the historic memory. So particularly from a U.S. perspective, the rise in inequality is obviously not a new thing. It's been a continuing thing. It's much more acute now than it was in the early phases, but it was already pretty obvious to anyone who wanted to look during the 1980s. So you could already see there was widening gaps at multiple levels. And that's not just, a few economists noticed it. It's actually the popular culture was aware of it. I just went back to look for the origins, the timing, the release of the movie Wall Street. Probably people have seen it, right? And it's kind of a shock to find out that movie was released in 1987. And not only was the movie, about inequality and the rise of the rich, it actually was. Oliver Stone, the director, was perfectly well aware that inequality was not simply a matter of, educated people pulling away from less educated, but that there were extreme heights. And there's my favorite line in the movie when one character ridicules the other as, do you just want to be another $400,000 a year working Wall Street stiff, flying first class and being comfortable, So that's clearly, that was nothing. Even in 1987, people understood that was nothing compared with what real wealth amounted to. And by the late 1980s, the numbers were very clear for the U.S. There had been a dramatic divergence already between overall economic growth and median family income, between productivity and wages. So the question becomes, why did it take so long? Now, there's really been an explosion of interest in inequality. We see it very much at the Stone Center now. We just see, that the number of people who want to hear from us and want us to answer questions is over the past few years, actually since I arrived, has just exploded. But why did it take so long? I'm going to give you in just a few minutes, I'm going to give you 3 things that I know about, because I think I was in some ways part of the scene. Never been much of an original inequality researcher myself, but associated with it in one way or another. So the first thing that happened was dismissal. It's 3 Ds, and the first one is dismissal. Well, people did not want to talk about it. I wrote my first book for a broader audience, first non-technical book, The Age of Diminished Expectations, in 1989. And one chapter of that book was about rising inequality. Which was already obvious. There was already plenty of evidence. CBO in the United States was already doing actually something of kind of thing that we've been discussing at our symposium, trying to merge administrative data and survey data to produce our overall income distribution measures. The publishers, for complicated reasons, the book was put together under the auspices of the Washington Post. They actually asked me repeatedly to take the chapter out. They said, nobody cares about this. And it was kind of weird. It just was not what people of that kind of set, not what people inside the Beltway wanted to hear. So there really was just a really strong disinclination to even talk about inequality, even though as of the late 1980s, it was already obvious that it was a big deal. So that's my first thing. It just, we can, we may along the way talk about why that strong disinclination, but clearly a lot of people in positions that, in a sense, gatekeepers of the public discourse did not want to talk about inequality. The second thing that happened was denial. By the early 90s, for sure, how could you really, there was lots of evidence that inequality had increased dramatically in the U.S., except there were also a lot of people making an effort to deny it. There was a substantial part of the 1992 economic report of the president. This is the first Bush, basically asserting that there had been no significant increase in inequality. There was already a kind of industry of attempts to show that inequality wasn't actually rising, that it was somehow a statistical illusion or something like that. It's I wrote a paper, if anyone's curious, kind of historical record. I wrote a paper in 1992, an article, not a paper, for the American Prospect called "The Rich, the Right, and the Facts," that just went through these various statistical arguments that were clearly bogus, but there was enough. I think one way to say this is that there was enough lack of understanding of how one goes about measuring inequality, that it was possible to get away with some semi-plausible dodges, although some not at all plausible. Actually, just to say, my favorite was there was a great deal being made at the time of the fact that if you took a group of people, a particular point in time, and you looked at the people who were in the bottom quintile, and then looked at those same people 10 years later, they had much bigger income gains than people who had been in the top quintile over the next, and yes, a regression towards the mean, but that was the concept that I think the people who did this understood that concept, but they hoped that the public did not. And so that was the denial phase. And then there was a third phase, which went on through the 90s, and I say some ways into the 2000s, which I think of as detour. We lost, I include me because I'm part of it, not entirely, but a lot of people lost sight of what exactly was the issue. We came to identify inequality with just one thing, which was the education premium. It was the college non-college wage gap, or some perhaps a bit higher up the scale, but mostly college non-college wage gap, and that was not an issue that was neglected. On the contrary, there were lots and lots of papers. There were lots of papers in labor economics. There were lots of papers in international economics, which was my home field, because there was this huge focus that we have this increase in the college non-college wage gap. Is that globalization? Is it rising trade? Is it technology? How do we apportion the causes? I think at this point there was a kind of consensus, which I have to say, I guess I probably shared, that technology was the driving force. I'm far less convinced of that now. That looks much worse in the light of subsequent data. But in any case, it should be clear that was the wrong question, because inequality is only partly about the education premium. It's a much broader set of issues. That education premium explains less and less of what we see, particularly since 2000, less and less of what we actually see in terms of rising inequality. The measurement has been crucial all the way. Partly just getting better measurements, and the lack of good measures, I think, has been a really there was a long period when basically the U.S. CPS was what we had. Which was problematic both because the U.S. CPS has its own limitations, as everybody here knows very well, but also because what about other countries? The comparative data was crucial. And also because there are a whole bunch of issues that go within that. It's not just comparing the evolution of different income quintiles. Well, important is missing a large part of the story, so there's a lot more to be learned. What I still find, I think my charge here was, in a way, to explain the history and why are we talking about it now. And I'm not sure I can answer that question, because at some level, a lot of this, the fact that inequality was drastically increasing, the fact that it wasn't just about education, that all of the measurement issues people were raising, whatever they were not remotely enough to explain away what we were seeing. That was all obvious 20 years ago. So why did it take so long to get to this point? The answer is I don't really know. But at least we are finally talking about the issue now, and I hope we'll have a productive discussion now. Thanks.
Paul, you slipped in a quick half sentence there about technology. Can you, since we live in the age of technology by the characterization that some use for our early 21st century, it almost seems counterintuitive when you say, no, actually technology may not be the driver, when in some respects it has enabled people to do remarkable things and accumulate a lot of capital with it. But you are saying it may not actually be the key explanation that drives inequality. Can you maybe say a few more words? What is prompting that?
I wish I had, I wish I had Larry Michel hiding behind there so I could pull him out to explain this. But no, skill-biased technological change was the default orthodox position for quite a while. It was always I mean, obviously technology changes. Technology is always changing. But the idea that technology was driving the rise in inequality rested mostly upon residual, actually. You saw that the college premium was rising. We could do a reasonable job of quantifying the effects of international trade, which were significant but not huge, not remotely enough to explain what we were seeing. And so you sort of fell back on a technological explanation. There was a little bit of evidence that actually using IT was associated with higher wages, but not that much. And if you looked at many of the people who were doing very well in the economy, they were not obviously people who were benefiting in any direct way from the use of technology. So we kind of fell into this residual. Since 2000, college wage premium has just not been a big factor. Most of the evidence that purports to show some drastic technological shift is at least arguable. We can go back and forth, and it's a technical thing, but it's not great, and it's there is particularly right now everybody's talking about robots, and the robots are everywhere except in the data. So I think the point is not that technology doesn't matter, but that a technologically deterministic story about income distribution is really it doesn't fit with anything we've been seeing for the past 2 decades.
Thank you, Paul. We'll come back to that and other aspects. May I now turn to Mario Cimoli, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary, Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And Mario, through your own work and that of CEPAL over decades, Latin America, in particular South America, became a sort of poster boy for the Gini coefficient gone wrong in much of the 80s and 70s and probably into the 90s. Then something remarkable happened in parts of Latin America, whether it was in Brazil with President Lula or others, Bolsa Familia. What is the journey that you would describe for Latin America and the Caribbean, having just listened to Paul describe the sort of dismissal denial phase even into the late 90s in North America and parts of Europe, where in fact inequality was, I would argue, almost posited as a good thing. You know, a tide will raise everyone, but inequality is part of raising the tide, almost argument. And yet in Latin America, the critical limits of social cohesion were already hitting red lines, isn't it?
Yes, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to say there is some positive issue here. 10 years ago, people speak only about reducing poverty, okay? Don't worry about this inequality is increasing. Don't worry about if you have to grow, inequality can increase. If you are a policymaker, think about poverty. I think it's a real issue. Today, you are organizing this meeting. There is other meeting around the world, whereas people is not speaking only about poverty, but inequality. It is, for me, for us, ECLAT, and your organization, clearly it's an important step. Discussing about inequality as an issue, target of policy, is an important issue. Latin America is the region that has more higher inequality around the world. That is clearly, this has reduced in the last 10 years, but that is more related to the labor market and social policy. And today, again, these indicators began to be worse again. It's a situation that is a structural one. It's not only, you need a combination of both sides. You need a combination of fiscal policy plus labor plus, sorry about that, industrial policy. because as Paul said before, it's not only education on the supply side, you need a demand side. And you need a demand side where people have to find a job, have to find a labor, have to be higher productivity. And don't tell me, each country around the world is doing a lot of industrial policy. And we need to think about that. It's a combination of fiscal, social, industrial, because there you have the demand. I think that the problem in the region and many of our middle-income countries, if we want, or the countries in transition, is to rethink about the combination of all aspects. I want to close. Technology, I don't think this, I agree, it's not deterministic, but technology is impacting tax reform because we are thinking about to create a new tax in the new sector, but it's impacting also the new job and the new sectors because it's completely different. The region needs, and I think in most developing countries, and your seminar and your meeting go in the perfect, right direction because we have to rethink about that.
But can I ask a very heretic question for a moment? You put a great deal of emphasis on industrial policy. If you look at the last 200 years, essentially industrialization has inevitably produced greater inequality. Or is that a false conclusion? So why does industrial policy suddenly become a tool to actually address inequality?
Yes, if you take the case of China, not necessarily the industrial policy produces more inequality. Industrial China has reduced poverty, improved Gini coefficient. The situation is quite good. It's introducing an enormous industrial policy. One of the most important cases on that. The development of Europe, you can understand Europe in the last years of the Second World War, is industrial policy. Germany was the most important country, creating also firms that was supporting the development process. Not necessary because you said industrial policy is the right one, but you need some type of industrial policy because it's the demand side. The problem and the worry about us is that you need social policy, of course. You need tax, but you need also to have some intervention to create the demand for those people that have to be educated to have a place in the labor market.
Thank you, Mario. We'll come back to that in a moment. Lucas, may I turn to you? World inequality. In your team working across the world, you have put together a network that is credited with being the closest to understanding how income inequality can be measured and how it is defining also developmental political outcomes. Can you say a couple of words about why you feel that what you're able to measure today is so much more accurate, and why does that make it more relevant in terms of people being able to act upon that information? You know, we often talk about this, we need more data, we need more information, more disaggregation. Why does it actually matter, and how have you done it?
You know, I think one of the promise of the Sustainable Development Goals is really to try to replace inequality at the center of, the drive towards sustainable development. And to some extent, there will always be a certain level of inequality characterizing countries at the level of the world, within countries, within regions, etc. But if this level reaches extreme values, then it can lead to all sorts of political, social, environmental, economic disasters. And it seems to me, and it seems to us at the World Inequality Lab, and I think this is shared within the community of researchers focusing on the measurement of inequality, that the first condition to properly address inequality is to properly measure it. But I'm going to paraphrase Paul here. Inequality is everywhere, but it's not in public statistics. And it's not in public statistics partly because of the lack of transparency, because of the extreme opacity of the financial system, but also because governments sometimes are unwilling to release information about inequality, about income and wealth. And also perhaps because, and this relates to what Paul was saying, because perhaps part of the economics profession was not interested in measuring or in focusing on inequality. So for us, it is extremely important to reveal this information, to increase the level of transparency on income, but also on wealth, and also on other dimensions of sustainable development. But the thing is that it takes time to produce these measures in a harmonized way, in a way that everybody can access to it. And this is what we're doing. By publishing this information on income and wealth inequality within countries, between countries, we're not naive about the fact that it will solve the whole situation straight away, but this is really a condition for everyone to make their own idea about the optimal set of policies to tackle inequality. And we think that it's not experts, economists, who might have the optimal solution to that. This is a matter of public debates, and for such public debates to happen, we need these measures. And now, just one point on the methodology. This is the symposium that we were having over the past 2 days. The idea is really to try to make the most of all the types of sources of information available out there, and this is really the novelty within the community, I think, is to use survey data, is to use administrative tax data. It's also to use data from financial leaks. And this is a nice collaboration between researchers, but also journalists who can give us such data to better measure tax evasion. And the final word here, I really think that when you start to measure things, this is when things become important. In a way, measurement is not a partisan act, but it's a political act. It's about what we decide, what we collectively decide to look at. And when we started to have measures about the amount of tax evasion in the world, when we started to understand the importance of evaded wealth, that it's about 10% of global GDP that has been substantially increasing over the past 2 decades, this is when we started to have an impact on public debates and on policy debates.
Can I ask you, to what extent has technology changed your ability to do it? Because in some ways you are counting something that is a 19th century phenomenon. How much do people earn? How much do they pay in taxes? How much do they evade in taxes? The extreme, if you look forward maybe 10, 15 years, is that you can use Google Street Maps to essentially do a socio-economic profile and be able to determine in the city of New York exactly who is living in what household in what part of town, using artificial intelligence and all the new tools that are coming. So is income data going to remain critical and central, or how do you relate that to one, something we've already been discussing for many years, the multidimensional nature of poverty, and secondly, looking into the future, where are we going to get our data from, or is the data likely to become more holistic and therefore more human, more real in a way, or is that a non-issue?
I think that's part of the paradox I was referring to earlier. Private actors, banks, they have a lot of information about our intimacy, about the types of capital incomes we have, about the different sources of income. But governments do not have access to this information, at least many governments in the world. And this is really the challenge that we have ahead of us. It's developing a global public service of inequality measurement and of access to this inequality data. In order to do this, we need to use these new tools that modern technology provides. But I think it's really important, perhaps even before we start to measure the links between income and wealth and other dimensions of sustainable development, it's necessary to do so. But it's also extremely important to have our measures of income inequality rights and of wealth inequality rights. And today, governments are not even able to produce numbers of GDP by income groups. GDP growth by income groups, and it's extremely important to move towards these measures in order to make a step towards the resolution of inequality.
Thank you, Lucas. Let me turn to you, Janet. Janet Gornick, a professor of political science and sociology. So very deliberately also our recognition, this is not just a debate amongst economists and statisticians and measurers, general, to use a broad term. Can I start by asking Janet, to what extent or when, maybe in Paul's chronology, did inequality change from being a kind of outcome and symptom discussion in our society to actually being a cause and driver phenomenon in our political discourse? Because a little bit I sense that is what happened in our societies. It was either it was not material, we don't need to worry about it, or we don't want to look at it, and therefore people didn't really register it as something that they could manage or should be worried about. Today, all of us are talking about it. It is a driver, it is an explainer.
Yes, thank you, and thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. That's a very interesting question. I would say, and let me preface this by saying I too am getting older, and I've been working in the US in various areas in social policy for 30-some years, including starting with 6 years in Washington in the policy community. So I too have seen public discourse shift over many, many years. I think in the last 5 or 6 years, we've definitely seen a shift. Let me answer specific to the United States. In talking about inequality in instrumental terms. You know, we do often, many people talk about inequality in political science and sociology and elsewhere. It's you know, on normative grounds, it's wrong because it's wrong. That, you know, the haves have too much compared to the have-nots, it's not decent. And I think many of us who work in the field would agree with that, but in my experience in the US, the conversation has become much more an instrumental one, and I think that's been strategic. Because it has more traction in the US. What do we mean by that? We leave aside the question about whether inequality is bad intrinsically, and what I'm hearing mostly in the US and in Europe as well, we're worried about inequality because it's a drag on growth. We heard about this today. It's not an absolutely unambiguous finding, but there's lots of evidence that many forms of inequality are a drag on growth. There's a very powerful body of literature. Our colleague Miles Korak was summarizing it today, linking inequality also as a drag on intergenerational mobility. There is a growing literature linking concerns about inequality with corruption to the democratic process. So, and again, I think I've heard this conversation in Washington of people who are interested in inequality reduction purposefully making instrumental arguments because they think it's strategically wise, because these sort of second order effects, it's not contentious that those are problematic. Nobody wants a drag on growth or intergenerational mobility or the democratic process. So I hope I've answered your question. There's no question that there's been a shift in the last, I would say, 5 to 7 years, very much in the US and I think in Europe as well.
Now, having listened to the way we have framed one trajectory into this discussion, being a political scientist and a sociologist, do you find yourself aligned with that, or would you frame the discussion in the year 2019 about inequality from a different vantage point? And I could say now, is it income or is it you know, other measurements, or are we actually talking about something deeper? I mean, we've had inequality being a pervasive reality in our societies forever. So what has happened in a political, sociological, or political economy context, perhaps, that suddenly speaks to Paul Krugman's sort of you know, shift from the ability to dismiss it or just deny it?
But another excellent question. I think it's important to note something, and again, I'm going to cite someone other than myself. I'm actually a political economist by training, so I think I'm more of an economist than I'm a political scientist, so I hope that won't ruin the premise of your question. My colleague Leslie McCall, also in the Stone Center, has studied public opinion and also public awareness about inequality using survey data. There's really very few data on public opinion towards inequality. And actually, she has pointed out something to me and to our colleagues repeatedly. This explosion of interest is really an elite phenomenon. She would chastise me because I've said so many times we've had this massive explosion. And what's my evidence for that? As Paul sort of hinted, you know, my phone used to ring from journalists about twice a year asking about inequality, and now it's about 5 times a week. You know, that was really the case in the last 5 years. There's a massive explosion in inequality centers. There are literally 25 new inequality centers in the United States. There are new master's programs. And so there's an explosion of interest, but it is among academics and policymakers and journalists. She has reminded us that actually, if you look at public opinion data and also data about awareness, Americans, again, forgive me for being so American in this answer, the level of interest and concern about inequality has been actually quite steady over the last 35 years. So I think it's a top-down change that has really affected those of us who are working in the field.
Well, I think we should explore that a little bit more in a moment, because I think it's not only in the United States, perhaps, that this phenomenon has been there. Let me now turn to my colleague, Kunal Sen, United Nations University, wider, somebody who has spent much of his life also looking at the issues of inequality, of political economy, but also of inclusive growth. So I mention that in part because it is one of the narratives that we have developed also over recent years of how would we address something like this. The agenda, 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, in their own way, were a contemporary articulation of an ever-growing unease with something that had to be addressed in another way. So, Kunal, from the bird's eye perspective of a United Nations university looking at this issue of inequality, would you today characterize this as, maybe even if it's in timing terms a little bit different, a universal phenomenon that we're observing in this issue having become a defining either narrative or critique of development, however you want to frame it, or is it in 1,000 places manifesting itself in 1,000 different ways?
I think the first thing is that, you know, we've seen remarkable progress in measuring inequality in the rich countries, middle-income countries, thanks to the work of the World Inequality Lab and Luxembourg Income Survey. But we really don't know much about inequality in low-income and low-middle-income countries. And I do think that's the last mile in measuring inequality, with the most difficult mile. Why is it the most difficult mile? Because exactly as Lucas pointed out, you have to work with tax authorities, you have to work with statistic agencies, collecting better survey data, collecting better tax data. It's not a political will issue, it's a capacity problem. And I think we need a global partnership which essentially pulls together all that those who work on the space, mostly in richer and the middle countries, with partnerships with UN member countries in this parts of the world where measuring inequality still is pretty much in its infancy. So the first point is that we don't really know enough about how inequality has moved, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and many parts of Asia. So I would say the first thing is, let's try and get that right. Let's do the last mile. That should be really the way we should push it now, and try to get as many countries as we can in the understanding of inequality that so far have not really been studied in the same way. But having said that, if you look at most countries, especially in Asia, and this comes back to this point about industrialization, many countries in Asia have seen slightly different patterns in inequality. I mean, if you think about East Asia, and this point is important, that in East Asia there was a fairly initial move to equity in access to land, for example, human capital, and there was also a very important trajectory of labor demanding economic growth. It was through industrialization, it was labor demanding. And so that's where the inclusive growth agenda and inequality agenda come together. Because what's the real challenge right now in Africa and in South Asia? Creating decent jobs for those who are in the informal economy who really won't probably have very difficult for them to move to the formal sector, which is shrinking because of premature industrialization. So that's where I think the inclusive growth agenda, or the decent work agenda, and the inequality agenda move together, because you can't really have one and not have the other. And I think that's where I think we need to have a better sense of what policy options actually bring these two agendas together, and these two very important policy concerns that anybody in Africa or in Asia has, that I want to create jobs for my population, but I also want to make sure that I want to try and reduce inequality wherever it occurs.
Thank you, Kunal. Let me turn last in our first round to Luis Felipe. Luis Felipe is now the Assistant Secretary General, Regional Director for the Bureau of Latin America and the Caribbean in UNDP. Until last year was in the World Bank, where he worked both in the poverty practice context, in the World Development Report office. And to you, I want to ask the question, Luis, you looked at this issue of poverty and inequality across very different settings in our globe. To what extent would your experience suggest that inequality has become a policy preoccupation of government as opposed to a maybe phenomenon of populism or intellectualization of the political economy of our societies? I mean, if you look across the experience you have with Latin America, with East and Central Europe, what are driving forces that you would describe, explain our central preoccupation with inequality today?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the HCRO for the invitation. I will start by saying that it's very interesting that you talk about these differences across regions. We started in 2006, 2007 an analysis of the trends of inequality in Latin America, here actually in UNDP, invited people from different countries, because we actually started looking at a decrease in inequality that was quite striking, and even though the level was still high, the trend was actually a downward trend. So we started looking precisely at what Professor Krugman was talking about. So there was a wage compression. There was, 2/3 of the reduction in inequality were due to labor market dynamics related to wage compression. The other third was because of better incidence of social policies. And then when I went to the bank and started working in Eastern Europe, we also saw that. But at the same time, that didn't coincide with what people were saying in the surveys, that actually they perceived that inequality was increasing. And in the public discourse, it was more and more common to talk about inequality increasing. And it was interesting to see the reaction. And I would like to say something about how this process has helped us as development economists to do things better. Because I think one of the first reactions was, well, people don't understand that inequality is actually going down, or they don't have the right information. But at some point, the question was rather, we may be doing something wrong, because people are perceiving that inequality increases, and we keep saying that inequality is going down. And I think there are at least 3 ways in which we then moved into measuring better. So one was looking at how to look at top incomes that were typically underestimated in the surveys, and try to come up with methodologies. Still, we are developing that methodologies to measure better top incomes. The other was to look at the stock and not only flow, to look at wealth. And this, a lot of the work that you have cited related to Oxfam and other people's work. So we looked at actually wealth inequality, and it was rising. And the other was the interaction between labor, the share of labor versus the share of capital in national accounts, and clearly the share of labor was falling. So we started looking at all these other aspects, and we realized that actually we had been measuring the wrong thing. So I think that is very important. But also that led us to think about how to go beyond income. And then we looked at other dimensions of inequality. And to understand the process of inequality, and this leads me to a very concrete way to answer your question, is that inequality was both a symptom and a driver of manifestations of power asymmetries in society. So basically what you see is that what makes inequality increase and persist is the fact that some groups have more influence over the policy-making process, and other groups cannot make the system responsive to their needs. So that becomes a more structural issue, and that's where it becomes very politically salient. So it's not only an issue of how to redistribute, but how to understand better the process that generates inequality, and try to look at all these other dimensions, which then changes completely the way in which we give policy advice. So I would say that it has been a very important learning process also.
Thank you. May I turn back to you, Paul, for a moment, and perhaps ask you to now speak in the modus operandi that you have when you write your column. You are a very influential synthesizer of public sentiment and public debate. So when you speak to a readership, an American public or a global public right now, what is it that you would encourage them to see as opportunities to act on these phenomena? And one thing is that we can describe them in income terms, multidimensional poverty, Gini coefficient, all the other elements, wealth as opposed to just income. Bottom line is, we are seeing a lot of tension around the sense that something is not fair, it's not just, and whether you look at the phenomena that President Ramaphosa is currently trying to deal with state capture in South Africa, whether you look at the phenomenon of Brazil's population and middle class turning against its own notion of government and the state because of the sense of corruption, and this is something that we also see in other countries. There are many different, let's say, motivators of a public debate, but you provide in your columns often an analytical way of giving expression to a public sentiment. So what do you say to an American public today that is saying, well, okay, we don't really understand the economists or the intellectual class explanation of inequality, but we know something's wrong. What do we offer as a way of engagement on this issue?
Well, first, what you really need to understand is that I make a lot of political arguments and have a not complete but very extended track record of losing, right?
Called innovation.
By and large, my side loses the political battles, and we remember the times we've won. Now, I think if we look at where I tend to look in doing these things is for think of a Venn diagram of things that an economist or a political economist thinks would be good things to do about inequality, and things that the public appears to support. We would have a big problem if there was not much overlap there. But it turns out there is quite a lot, so that there are several things, and this is a very, with Janet, I'm going to apologize for being so American on this, but this is where I know both the public opinion data. And so people want to have guaranteed health care. The United States is unique in advanced countries in not having that. People want higher wages. Minimum wage increases are extremely popular. People think the rich pay too little in taxes. That's interesting. Just some very recent polling. The fraction of people who believe that the rich pay too little in taxes. You can compare that with the fraction of the people who believe that they themselves pay too much. And you might be surprised. We know everyone keeps on telling us that America is a center-right country, but according to the polling, there are 3 times as many people who are upset that the rich pay too little than are upset that they themselves paying too much. So there's a set of things you can talk about. You can talk about policies that expand the social safety net, which in the U.S. means most obviously health care, but there are a bunch of other things. You can talk about trying to pay for them by raising taxes on high incomes. And you can talk about attempts at pre-distribution, attempts to raise wages, especially via the minimum wage, which is an area where 25 years ago there would have been a big conflict between what the public believes and what economists believed, where the public was all for higher minimum wages and economists said, oh no, that'll cost jobs, but thanks largely to the late Alan Kruger and the line of work that he began, we know that actually, at least at US levels of the minimum wage, there does not appear to be that kind of trade-off. So there's a fairly straightforward agenda of taxing at the top, enhancing transfer benefits, further down the scale, and trying to enhance bargaining power, that is plenty to go on right now. I mean, and that's the, so I don't think it's not a hard thing to do right now. Now, to some extent, I've just described Elizabeth Warren's economic platform, right? But it probably, in fact, the platform of whoever gets the Democratic nomination. The thing, of course, is there's no guarantee that will win, that any of this will happen. But it's actually, these are times when the conflict between being a good economist and being a very low energy social justice warrior is very small. They basically call for the same thing.
Can I follow this up with a question? I'll leave that also for other panel members to address. Isn't perhaps one of the problems that we have allowed ourselves to be entrapped in an economic pseudo-methodology, perhaps, of understanding how economies work, when really, very often, these choices are contemporary political, social choices we make. I'm reminded by you may recall the video that went viral from Davos of a Dutch, I think it was an economist who kind of lost his temper and said, stop talking about this, it's taxes, taxes, taxes. And then a few weeks later, I remember reading that actually the highest tax rate, the progressive tax rate in the United States was close to 90%. Was it in the 1960s or something?
50s, under that socialist Dwight Eisenhower, yeah.
So at a certain point in time in America, and that many today associate with the great American age, we were at the opposite end of a set of public policy choices. How does one explain that as an economist or a political economist? Because we have lived in the last 20 to 30 years increasingly under a regime of this is how markets work, this is how monetary supplies are managed, this is how inflation and GDP growth determine well-being or successful outcomes in development. And yet, the diversity of the last 50 years across the globe seems to say the exact opposite.
Okay, I mean, surely somebody else will want to weigh in on this, but what's remarkable about, at least, well, not just in the U.S. context, but it's certainly very dramatic in the U.S. context, is that this orthodoxy you're describing is not one that the public shares. Public opinion polling is pro-progressive taxation. Public opinion polling is pro-social expenditure. The belief that higher tax rates on top income, that a more progressive tax system has very bad incentive effects, is not something that the general public shares. And oddly, it's not something that the economics profession shares either. It's a certain part of the political economic elite that has these views. And so we had this, the objective, this sort of object lesson, not objective, object lesson, where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who, by the way, we all hate in the journalistic trade because there are so many characters in her name that it eats up a large part of your column space every time you mention her. AOC says we should have a 70% tax rate on the top 1%, or on very high incomes. Where is she getting that crazy notion? Well, the actual answer is Peter Diamond and Emmanuel Saez, right? This is the best people in the field have actually come up with this number. I think she probably got it indirectly through Joe Stiglitz. And you had people in the media, people watching saying, this is ridiculous. And then you had, on the other hand, the public polling was quite favorable, and the economics profession was quite favorable because, hey, this is Peter Diamond we're talking about. So I think we really need to be talking about something about something, by the way, that Thomas Piketty talks about quite a lot in his book, the ability of the economic elite to set the terms of discourse. There's an awful lot of stuff that I use the term, very serious people. There's an awful lot of stuff that people in the dominant political elite believe that becomes to be known as what everybody knows to be true, that is neither actually true nor what the general public believes.
The great mythology of communication in the 20th century. Luca, since Paul just mentioned the point at which you, let's say, transition from the analytical empirical work of on inequality, and with Thomas Piketty in France now having become also, and this is not the same as the Inequality Data Lab, I want to acknowledge that, but nevertheless, he, building on the analytical understanding of what the work has shown, has become a major protagonist in a directional debate about future public policy in France. Can you explain us a little bit what is behind that, and what are some of the conclusions that he draws out of this inequality data that leads him to now become also a polarizing figure in the public debate?
I think if there's one key output of this work that compares the trends in inequality across countries and over time, is really the idea that there is no determinism in the rise of inequality. It's not a mechanical byproduct of technological change. We've been discussing this before. It's not a mechanical byproduct of the exposure to more trade across countries. And this point is made really clear when you look at the evolution of inequality in the US on the one side and of Europe on the other side. These two regions were exposed more or less in the same, in the same way to technological change, to globalization. And in one side of the Atlantic, you see the explosion of the top 1% income share, and not in Europe. And I think, this comparison was also really helped with the use of new data. So one of the key conclusions of that is that we can do stuff about inequality, and this also links up to the SDG agenda, which is that we need to look at all countries, and all countries can learn from each one another. And we see, for instance, good ideas of what can be done to tackle inequality in Europe. So we've been discussing that, social policy, fiscal policy, but also industrial policy, if we look a bit backward in time. So yeah, to sum up, I think one of the key output really is policy matters, and there is no silver bullet to tackle inequality. But if we look at what countries have been doing over the world over the past decades, well, there's a lot of things that that we can do. And of course, Thomas is also fairly known for his defense of fiscal and tax policies. And of course, when you look at the European story, yes, tax policy had a huge impact to tackle inequality, but it's a comprehensive picture. Tax policy, what? To finance social spending.
But France is a highly indebted country. Can I just ask one follow-up question? Highly indebted country in terms of, revenue, public expenditure, etc. Are the gilets jaunes, the yellow vests now, just to stay with the contemporary expression of, something is not going quite right in a country, even though in France, protest is very much part of the political culture, as one often says, it's gotten a little bit more intense. And are they a product of this phenomena of inequality or lack of public spending, or are there other things that are more central explanations to this?
So the Gilets jaunes story in two lines. Government comes in with this great idea to scrap the wealth tax and to partly scrap the progressive income tax system. Why? Well, potentially partly because of a policy software that is perhaps inherited from, a few decades ago, from the 70s, from the 80s. Another possibility is also to understand, this mismatch between public opinion that is, as Paul was saying, not in favor of scrapping tax progressivity, and a certain form of policy elite that is in favor of that. One way to understand that is also to understand the financing of the political campaigns and of the political world. If you have much more billionaires in the world, well, there's much more billions to be spent on supporting electoral, candidates, and so this can also help us understand why the political elite might support things that are not in line with public opinion. So what the French government did, scrapped the progressive wealth tax, and on the other side implemented a carbon tax that is a consumption tax that is regressive. So on the one side, you reduce the tax burden on the very rich, and you increase it on the lower income groups, on the middle income groups, on the grounds that this is important to fight for sustainability. And it's important to fight for sustainability. But when you do it in that way, you can understand that it creates a lot of discontents.
It's kind of a two-handed intervention, just for once to talk about a different country, because France is a very interesting case, because France gets terrible press. The French economy is constantly bashed. You hear always about everything that's wrong and what is the disease that afflicts France. And like everybody, France has bad policies and problems. But the biggest disease afflicting the French economy is hypochondria. People are always telling them how terrible it is and how much they must move in an Anglo-Saxon direction in their policies in ways that are not at all justified by the actual economic record. And what looks like from an outsider is that Macron bought into this. Basically, Macron, instead of talking to Joe Stiglitz, he was talking to Jamie Dimon or something like that, right? And in effect, was listening to the wrong people about what France needs. And that's not the only. There's lots of other things behind the Gilets jaunes and all of that. I mean, we haven't talked at all in any of this, as far as I know, about regional inequality, which is a very big deal. But still, I mean, France is almost the object lesson in how the orthodoxy that everybody seriously believes is neither what the public believes nor what the economists believe.
Over to you, and then we'll go to Mario.
I just wanted to underscore, if I could, what Lucas said. I think it's really important. It may be known to everyone in the room here, but a lot of the discussion about inequality sounds like this. Inequality has risen, is rising everywhere. It's inevitable. It's globalization. It's technology. It's neoliberal, shifts in capitalism, etc. That is absolutely not correct. I mean, the data really don't show that. Among the rich countries, something that we've been looking at a lot in the last few days, for the most part in the last 30 years, inequality rose in about 2/3 of the countries, but in the other third, it either was flat or fell in similar countries. And when we look around the world, we saw statistics at our meeting today. For every, about 2/3 of the countries in the world, inequality fell, while in the third they rose. National institutions matter, and they matter a lot. And the ways in which they matter are actually quite well known. If we look at the very high levels of inequality in the United States, they're almost completely explainable. The pre-fisc or the market inequality, the U.S. has the lowest minimum wage among the rich countries. It has the lowest rate of unionization. There are whole areas of income transfer that don't exist in the United States. So we really know why the inequality in the United States looks quite different, and why it's different from other similar countries. I'm getting excited. And
that's good.
And they're institutions, and we know what they are. So again, national institutions, I think, matter. These are country-specific stories. There is no one single story, but I think once again, it's in the United States, it's a question of political will. It's not a question of lack of knowledge.
Can I just stay with you for a moment, Jen? And I want to, in that second round, make the link to the debate in the street as opposed to in the labs and in the statistical domain. AOC, to go back to Paul's point. Why is America debating simple policy choices in terms of capitalism versus socialism in the year 2019? What has happened to the American public policy discourse and discord, so to speak? And as you just pointed out, socialism could be perfectly electable in the United States of the year 2021, right? I mean, it's not inconceivable, which if you had listened in 3 years ago, if somebody would have told you that there are candidates that would be running for presidency that are associating themselves explicitly with a narrative that you can either label socialist or whatever, would not have happened. Can you explain a little bit? And how does that perhaps link to the debate again about inequality or the analytical end of it?
If I could explain American politics, I would deserve the Nobel Prize. The current period is obviously, it's very complicated and idiosyncratic. I actually think we don't even really know exactly why Trump became the president. There's all
we're not trying to go back there.
Right, but I mean, in other words, to try to explain what's happening in the United States and what's happened in the last few years, political scientists have been looking at this, journalists. It also actually is I think it's the combination of about 10 different causes which led to this political outcome. I don't think it's a single story. We find ourselves debating, is it the economy stupid? Is it racism? What is it? The United States political situation is very difficult to explain, I would say. I think that it was a combination of obviously the crisis and some extraordinarily effective politicking on the conservative side, telling stories that simply couldn't be and weren't effectively countered by the left. Now, what's happening now? There's this enormous, buzz in progressive politics in the United States. I think what do we have now? Something like 18 candidates, and the big question is, are they going to run from the left or from the center? And I think everybody knows the argument. The excitement is on the left. But that makes people concerned about the general election. And I think anybody predicting the next election, it's a fool's errand. We just really don't know.
Can I sort of weave together a little bit these two worlds and go to Mario for a moment and ask a question that you just reminded me, Mike Moore and his movie Sicko. I don't know how many of you may have seen it, about health systems and so on. And I will never forget this wonderful scene where he interviews Americans who live in Paris and explain what a pregnant family or a pregnant woman or then a mother can expect in terms of services the day after she has given birth to a baby. And the way that Mike Moore sort of captures it at the end is that in America, people don't trust their government. And in Europe, people demand of their government to provide services. Now, obviously, this is a very simplistic way of looking at it, but I want to just take that as a backdrop to this very different interpretation of the role of government, or the confidence of people in government, or the license for government to shape development outcomes. Mario, Latin America has been like an oscillograph in the last 30 years, from left to right to dictatorships to turmoil in both individual countries across the full spectrum and certainly regionally. What is the role of government and governance in contemporary Latin America today? Can one discern some drivers that will explain whether the issue of inequality, which is there in the political discourse, is actually being acted on? Lula at the time being one example, right?
I want to say what you said about countries' institutions. I think it's a crucial one. But when you take countries' institution, you think institution that is not created on the air, is not created in the empty space. Institution has to be with the political economy of the country. When you speak about the political economy of the country, you have solid institution. You had what's happened today in Latin America. You're moving from one government to the other, but the debate is very old debate. Is market versus not market. It's very, very strong, very, very, very exaggerated, if you want. There is not mediation. If you take what was in the last period, was less market, more institution, more intervention. Today, leave everything to the market, reduce action, and reduce. Has to be with institution. Has to be with the political economy. Have to do with who control production processes. If you take, I want to give an example. If you take what's happening in the export of Latin America today, you can understand clearly that there continues to be a concentration of natural resources in many parts of the country in the south that is affecting the way have you distributed, creating welfare, creating productivity, impacting productivity, and moving resources from the Latin American to the other. But this has to do with trade also, with the institution in the global context. That is, of course, is the country institution, but also the global institution are important. Because when you have not agreement in trade about there is no multilateral action that put the relationship with this, the demand, the exaggerated demand in Latin America of natural resources, that is creating a locking processes, and you have distributing bad, and you have to modify the process. We think that today, inequality could be a game changer to rethink and create these institutions. That is important. But not institution in the very only how you create taxes, that is good, but the important institution have to do with maintain the state, not only the government, maintain the institution, long-term policy, research, education, tax. That is what the region need to think about.
Thank you, Mario. Kunal, may I throw a little curveball to you, because one of the things that has dominated the debate about inequality is a pecuniary financial paradigm, whether income or wealth or whatever. You have also spent quite a bit of time doing work on Africa. If you look at the Africa at the beginning of the 21st century, much of its wealth is actually encapsulated in its natural capital, so to speak. And here we are at the beginning of the 21st century, climate change, many other phenomena of environmental degradation, erosion of that natural capital. Is this beginning to feature in an inequality narrative and also in a public discourse?
I think this, it's really important. You can put the attention only on inequality if you don't take together in symbiotic process what is sustainability. You can do that. For example, many times I think about Rosenthal wrote and I said about the big push. You know, think about the big push not only because Latin America needs a big push about investment and so on, but an environmental big push where you don't read only environmental policy and sustainability in terms of only on investment, but also creating the opportunity for the low level of income, to create an opportunity for the territorial areas in Latin America that are complex. That is a process that we need to put together. And you have to think, for example, take the case of Formosa. Formosa takes 3 countries, that is Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. You have there most of the important biodiversity in the world, you know. You need there to rethink about that because there you have concentrated a lot of inequality. It's rising there. Now, when you think about that, our mission, if you put our mission is to rethink inequality at the time of the sustainability policy. It has to be put together, it has to be put in the same way and with a process that is important in the region, with integration.
Can I pass the same question to Kunal also, because I think this is perhaps one of the things that we are grappling with in the Human Development Report, and if I may quote our dear friend Partha Dasgupta, who is a good friend, basically says, come back to me with the Human Development Report when you've understood how sustainability matters to the Human Development Index. I'm paraphrasing him now. He has done it in his most generous form of being engaged. And I think it points to an interesting blind spot, perhaps just like you described inequality in terms of dismissal, denial in the 70s and 80s. Where are we on this issue today, Kunal?
I think firstly...
And in connection with inequality, I'm not as necessarily as separate.
Well, I think that on natural resources, particularly in the case of Africa, I think one has to understand that it is still the most important resource they have. And we have to understand, because of course there are shifts that's happening in technology, shifts are happening around the question of extractives and so on, but the point is that still is the most important resource for many of the African countries. The question then is how do you manage the resource well? there is this problem that we often think in economics or even political science, there's some kind of a resource curse out there. But there are many countries who have actually done very well with resources. The best example is Norway. But there are other countries in the developing world, such as Indonesia. So I think the first thing is that natural resource and the shift of happening technology, smartphones, now cobalt has become one of the most important metals right now. DRC Congo has a huge stock of cobalt. How do we make this country think through the resource in a way that can be used for their citizens? So there is a very important question around that, which I think we need to think through, and I don't think there are simple answers there. On the question of climate change, I think that the other thing I do think is that we have not thought through very well is exactly the question of how exactly all the question on inclusive growth and so on fits with the climate change agenda. And because the intergenerational issues here, which we haven't thought through. And I think that's a very important issue again for the international community to think through, because there is this problem that we don't think about future generations as much as we think of current generations, and we should.
Thank you. In a moment, I'll turn to the audience, so please sharpen your pencils or intellects if you have any comments, questions, reactions. But Luis Felipe, Paul just alluded very briefly also to the geography of inequality. May I for a moment ask you, because in Latin America, but also beyond that, and we are debating in UNDP right now very intensely, this notion that the future of development will only play out in the urban industrialized economy of the 21st century. And somehow, because we now have 50% of the world living in urban areas, everybody is focused on the urban areas, when actually 49% or 49.5% still happen to live in the rural areas, particularly in developing countries. What does the inequality data and analysis teach us at this moment in time on how to understand, in a developmental policy-making sense, what happens next with the rural economy, with that 3.5 billion people, or soon 4 billion people, that are not yet in factories or in the services sector or in the informal sector of the cities, or living in slums in the great metropolis of the 21st century?
Thank you. I think I would start by mentioning, there is a paper in 2011 by Chico Ferreira that it's called Distributions in Motion, that reminds us that growth and distribution are determined jointly. And I think this is important. I use it to introduce the idea, because it's important to see what is the process behind the inequality we observe. And not all inequalities are born equal. And this is very important, because we can agree on all the instruments that can be used to reduce inequality, but how you use those instruments will depend a lot on the specific context. And I think that relates also to the geography, how the different policies interact to shape the inequalities that we observe throughout the territory. Again, Professor Krugman has written, for example, with Raul Libas, a very good paper in the Journal of Development Economics, to show how trade policy led to urban concentration, in the case, for example, of Brazil and Mexico. So how all these different policies interact. But I would go back to your question on governance. At the end, I think this has to do also with the political incentives also concentrating the policy making to generate agglomeration in certain areas, and what some political scientists call the discontinuity of the state throughout the territory. What you have is different levels of state density throughout the territory, so the responsiveness of the system to different groups of people in different regions is differentiated precisely as a result of their incapacity to make the system responsive because of this inequality. So I would argue that strengthening the capacity to make the system responsive in all these, where there are holes or where there are discontinuities in a state presence, is one way to start, as a precondition to start with dealing with these discontinuities, and perhaps also rethink our traditional way of looking at structural transformation as a process that goes from agriculture to higher value-added manufacturing to services. We have seen many cases now in which there is a whole change to services without even going through manufacturing. So I think we also have to challenge the way in which we understand that process of structural transformation, and rather think of how to connect rural areas, enhance their productivity, and connect them to global value chains in ways that do not necessarily go through the traditional model that we have typically argued for.
Thank you, Luis Felipe. Let me now ask, do we have any microphones, or shall I? You have one there, wonderful. So I saw the first hand there, and then a second hand here. Yes, if you could briefly introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. My name is Alessandro Motter of the Interparliamentary Union. My question is very simple, looking also at the subtitle of the event, Rethinking Inequality. Should we not think of it more accurately as relative poverty? And how do we define relative poverty? I have the impression that that is sort of the forgotten child of this whole debate, even at the UN in general. And in fact, there is this strange contradiction that we have two narratives at the UN. One that says inequality is going way up globally, but good news, poverty is going down, because obviously it's very narrowly defined. We know the reason, the $1.9 per day. But relative poverty, I think, is a more useful concept, both politically and economically, because of course, as you said, Mrs. Steiner, we can have a bus full load of people who own half the world, but that has no relevance if the rest of the world can still live a decent life. But I have the impression that there is this gray area where inequality has grown such that it's not yet poverty. You're not living in abject poverty, including in the United States. But there is this huge area now that your quality of life, your life prospects are greatly diminished. So I wonder what the panel can say to explore this gray area, and also politically, if we should not be talking more about relative poverty. So it seems to me that if inequality is going up globally, we should be saying at the UN that poverty is going up globally when you combine absolute and relative poverty.
Thank you very much. Can I ask the panel members just to note down, and then I'll turn to you. Let's get a few questions, comments from the audience. Yes, please. Microphone is there.
Okay, my name is Stefano Vaccari. I'm a journalist here at the United Nations. From what I heard, I saw that first Professor Krugman, I think, said something like, well, for inequality, technology, they were thinking, but technology doesn't matter. And others say, if I understand, others say practically, no, it's not even so difficult to resolve the problem. We know how to do it. I mean, so it looks like the problem is simple. Well, then why we don't do it? That's the question. And so I think what is being, maybe said something, but briefly somebody say, if there is the 1% that support those politicians, now they get into power, then they would not know enough either, if those politicians, because the politicians, now on the hand we vote, so, and they support them, how? The money goes also to the media, for example. So my question is, the last election, 2016, for example, we had a socialist candidate that was Bernie Sanders. He was doing incredibly well because he started with not media at all support, doing incredibly well. And then he lost it for very little because all the media was practically saying it's impossible for this candidate, if he becomes the candidate, to win. So my question is, again, to the media, and maybe with Professor Krugman, he didn't finish what he was saying, like technology. Is the case that inequality, while finally he's on the debate, we all aware, we all talking about it, finally maybe we will have result, is because technology gave us a way to go around the media, because there are the socials, there are media online, and so we don't have any more CNN or Fox or others just to tell us who to vote.
Thank you very much. Let me collect a few more. Yes, lady here on the left.
Thank you to UNDP for organizing this interesting forum, and also for all the panelists. I just want to bring a question to actually to look at the second part of the subtitle, what to do about it. So we had thoughts about inequality, what it means in the new context, and then I would like to hear from our esteemed panelists, what can we do about it? I understand that very well that the country context is very important. Different countries will have different policies and different things will work in different countries. But I think it would be very interesting and stimulating to hear from our panelists if there are good practices in some particular countries, or they would propose certain policy options to different countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that certainly will be the last part of it. I mean, in some ways we touched around some of the solution narratives already, but I think you are quite rightly pointing to the fact that we want to end the panel session with very much a look at, is it a matter of having best practices, or is it a matter of making choices? I mean, it's a difference between a technocratic view of what works and a social, political choice in a society. You don't want to leave people behind, or you basically say, it's not my problem if you're left behind. And these are very different ways of looking at solutions. Let me look to the back also. I don't want to overlook anyone. Should I be worried that you have fallen asleep at the back? No? Okay, if no further questions, comments right now, let me go back to the panel. And perhaps in this round, can we push a little bit this notion also of, have you come across a fascinating solution that is working? It may be very unique to a particular community, a nation, or a political moment. I'm reminded of some of these phenomenal statistics that, for instance, in the Multidimensional Poverty Index, when we launched it last year with OFI in Oxford, this number of India having succeeded in lifting 270 million people out of poverty in a period of 10 years, mid-2000s to mid-2015. The Chinese example. But we can look to many countries where different moments, political moments, generated either policy innovation or a very different framing of public choice. So maybe each one of you could also speak to that, and maybe I'll start in the reverse order. So Luis Felipe, may I turn to you? And please, on the question of relative poverty or
yes.
Both questions.
No, so I think I'm going to fail you on the great solution, but
chicken.
Yeah. No, but I do want to comment on this question about whether what we should be concerned is basically about relative poverty only, and I think I understand why it is. The question comes from the idea that if everybody is being better off, why should we care about higher inequality? And I think precisely because what we have learned, and we were just discussing about this, that eventually higher inequality leads to policy distortions that start actually thwarting the capacity of the system to continue not only growing, but being inclusive. So that's precisely the point, that we care. One of the reasons why we care about inequality is because the asymmetries in the capacity to influence the system then lead to policy distortions. And I think that is one of the reasons why. And of course, if we go from the institutional or more political science perspective, it actually affects the quality of democracy, and eventually it undermines the democratic process. So I think that's why we should care. It's important to, maybe this question is an opportunity to stress why we are arguing that we should care about inequality beyond normative reasons that should be enough to care about inequality, but actually because of instrumental reasons. So it eventually undermines the system, and we are seeing cases of that very clearly in our times.
Thank you. Kunal, may I turn to you, please?
I think, so let me specifically look at the question of how do we do anything about inequality. And really, again, we should be careful here, because global inequality has got two components to it: within country inequality and across country inequality. So if you look at global inequality, which we know has been falling, it's been really falling, really driven by the fact that China's been doing very well to some extent, and also India. If you take those two big countries out, it's not so obvious that global inequality has been falling. And then the question comes in on that part, across country inequality, what can one do? And I think that's going to be a much more difficult question, because exactly as Luis Felipe pointed out, the routes that we had to economic development that was possible for the richer countries, for the emerging economies of East Asia, is kind of closing now for many other parts of the world. Industrialization is not much more difficult. Services are essentially in low productivity services, not the IT sectors, which are the most dynamic sectors. So within country inequality, across country inequality is going to be very much a difficult issue to reduce in the future. And I'm not very optimistic myself how much we're going to see a reduction in across country inequality in the next 20, 30 years. Now, within country inequality, we know there are some things you can do, taxes, transfers, so on. I would say on that, my view is that perhaps one should wait a little bit till you start moving on the economic growth, inclusive growth path, because it's difficult to think about that if you're a very poor country where you really haven't got the tax base, you haven't got the capacity to do the things you need for redistribution. So my view is that, perhaps get growth going for some time, then maybe think about that. Perhaps not leave it too late, but it's something that perhaps is not something that you want to think about in early stage of economic development.
Thank you. Mario, please.
I want to make an answer to about this. I think it's an important question about technology and media. Because many times I think technology is not good, it's not bad, it's a social construct. We created technology, society created technology, production created technology, institution is part of that. Many times when the young professional in economics want to begin to study economics, I said the first book that you have to read is Karl Polanyi about the Great Transformation, because there you can understand how the Industrial Revolution came out from UK, and you understand clearly how technology and production is not only a deterministic process. I think it's important. And I want to put, you remember 10, 15 years ago, the people said, no, we leave internet, because internet bringing with them democracy. Internet is bringing freedom. Internet is going to be quite a paradise. And today we understand that this is another technology. It had to be sometime regulated, had to be sometime evaluated, had to be sometime put in condition on tax and everything like that, because technology is a social product. And this vision, it is important to understand policy. If you don't understand that, we can understand policies. Technology is not bad and good. If you put about media, really, there is. Many people say today, the more orthodox in view in an equalitarian society control part of the technology. That is true. We have to understand. I think it's important. About what to do about policy. I think, of course, country institution matter is important. But if we need to recover, I don't know. This institution is important, UN. If we need to recover globalization, stay together in this world, we have to rethink many institutions at the global level. WTO, we have to rethink about trade. Trade is important, it's crucial for Latin America. Many of the richness and wealth of Latin America has to be done by trade. Take the case of Chile, take the case of Argentina. Brazil also has domestic market, but trade is important. With this type of tension, with no institution, it's a problem. I think there is in policy and action, there is different level of policy and action, but in this institution, UN, to rethink about what is the way to stay together in this multilateral process. And this governing technology across countries, governing trade, and governing sometimes inequality. Paul Krugman wrote a lot about the trade is not neutral also. And that is important to rethink about that. This is a good place and the important place to have this debate and policy action.
Thank you very much. Janet, the microphone here. Yeah.
Let me try briefly just to address two things, and they're both, in both cases I'm going to talk about high-income countries because that's where most of my work has been. Just to mention on the concept of relative poverty, I think that actually, if I understood your question right, I think that is the dominant paradigm in terms of thinking, I mean, if we think of all three of them, inequality, relative poverty, and absolute poverty, in Europe, in the OECD countries, I've worked for many, many years with the Luxembourg Income Study, a massive literature on poverty. Most of it, in fact, takes the approach of relative poverty. I think partly because it saves us from price estimates, which are always tricky, but also because it fits with the sociological notion, obviously, that people are judging their well-being relative to their own country. I think the interesting question is it your own country? Is it a group of countries? But it's also at the same time, I would just say, in the literature of the Luxembourg Income Study, many people realize there are important cases where we need to look at both. In a case like Ireland, during the rapid growth, relative poverty was going up while absolute poverty was going down. So a lot of us tend to look at the two together. They really are very, very different concepts. The second thing, to answer your question, if I understand you right, what can be done you're asking sort of, I don't know if you're asking what's politically feasible or what are the mechanisms that would reduce inequality. And I fear I've said this already, but there are many, I think, and they're all additive. And I would just mention a book that I'm sure many of you know, and I know that we all know. In 2016, Tony Atkinson, the great inequality scholar, British economist, and many say the godfather of inequality studies, published a book called Inequality, What Can Be Done? And it's a book in which he makes the case, he's mostly focusing on the UK and the US, but I think really on high-income countries, and makes the case for 15 different policy levers, some of them in pre-distribution, a term Paul used, policy tools that would shift the market allocation, things like the minimum wage, investment in preschool, strengthening women's employment, which is crucial for reducing inequality, and then several measures on redistribution, progressive taxation, more extensive Social Security, and then he went further with baby bonds and asset transfers. And the point is, his argument was, if a country did 2, 3, 4, or 5, there would be inequality reduction. If they enacted 10, there would be more. If they enacted 15, there would be more. And that these toolkits need to be fit to national political contexts. But again, I think that the mechanics of inequality reduction, especially in the rich countries, are fairly well understood, and there's quite an ambitious menu of policy tools.
Thank you. Lucas.
Yeah, on the first point on relative poverty, yes, we definitely need to look at it, but why do we also need to look at what is happening at the very top? I think a great example of that is, when Roosevelt in the 30s implemented these really high top marginal tax rates in the US, it's basically going beyond income. It's the idea that you need to save democracy from the risk of plutocracy, basically. And so yes, you need to care about what's happening to the bottom of the distribution of income, but you also need to care about what, how your society might become dysfunctional if there is too much concentration of wealth and of income at the top. And over the past 10 years, 15 years, there's a growing amount of research, also in the health literature, showing that in more unequal societies, health is much more affected. It's much worse, not only for the poor, but for everybody. So I think that's one point that we need to basically also think beyond income when we look at the top 1% and at its impacts on society. On the second point, what can be done, what needs to be done, just one dimension of the problem, and there are many of them, but I think really, environmental inequality is the new frontier of social inequality, and we cannot solve the economic inequality issue properly if we don't at the same time address the climate change issue. And some countries are not necessarily doing it in the right way. I mentioned the example of France, for instance, where you do a regressive tax reform at the same time as an environmental tax reform, but you see that politically this doesn't work out. There are some countries that, that manage to do it relatively well, and I often cite this example, for instance, of Indonesia, where you have a reduction in kerosene subsidies, so this is more or less like a carbon tax, but the revenues of this tax are massively invested into the development of social protection. So you have a combination, a synergy between the development of a social state and of an ecological state.
Can I just jump in here, Lucas? Because to me it is also fascinating, I have to say. I mean, if you describe it precisely in those terms, what happened in France, is that just an oversight, a lack of coordination, a design error, or myopia by those who were designing it? Because, as you say, we have examples around the world, and particularly when it comes to fuel subsidies. To me, it's always astonishing how countries still, in the year 2019, 2018, suddenly make the consumer pay the price for years of distorted market prices. Iran was another fascinating example. The IMF, actually 6 years ago, described how Iran, because it was going bankrupt on subsidizing fuels for its consumers, decided to essentially phase out fossil fuel subsidies, at the same time put in place a cash payment for every household in the country. To the middle classes, it was pegged at such a level that you were more or less not worse off than before. To the poorer people and to the rural economy, and connecting them because they needed to establish a bank account to receive the payment, it was the opposite of regressive, a progressive income or inequality correcting measure. With the impact that people were better off, that were poorer before, the middle class were not worse off, the carbon emissions were going down because people were now buying more fuel-efficient generators, motorcycles, and so on. So here is a classic example of a win-win policy, and yet you describe in France in the year 2018 a double policy blind spot that is difficult to understand. I mean, how is it an oversight, or how would you describe that?
You know, I think there's a bit
some of that is the lesson of what do we do differently from now on, right? That I'm trying to.
No, there's a bit of all the elements of answers in your question. I think if you want, the lack of investments in the energy transition before the implementation of a carbon tax makes it possible to understand why people don't have any alternative when faced to a rise in carbon prices. And this is what was the case in France. People were trapped in a carbon-intensive lifestyle and didn't have any possibility to change. So the only option they had was to pay the tax. And in other countries, take Sweden, for instance, they implement one of the highest level of carbon tax in the world from the 1990s onwards. But this comes after decades of investments at the local level. So it's the municipalities that invested in heat systems that made it possible for people, when the carbon tax jumped in, to actually change from one carbon-intensive heating system to a sustainable system fueled by firewood and sustainable firewood. This was not done in the case of France. This is done in the case of certain countries. So in that case, I think, yeah, if we look around, well, we don't necessarily have, you know, the totality of the solution towards a social and sustainable and fair, you know, growth pathway, but we have, you know, a large part of the solution already.
Thank you, Lucas. Paul, back to you.
All right. Let me just focus on, I think, three things here. So, policies for economic growth versus policies for reducing inequality. What do we know about policies to promote economic growth? I would say, to a first approximation, nothing. Basically, we don't know how to do that. We don't know what works. Many, you know, thousands and thousands of papers, much research, and in the end, we really don't know. I mean, if 25 years ago, in a room like this, probably we would have found a bunch of people who did know. They would Washington Consensus. They would have told you what needed to be done, and Mexico did all of that, and results are not catastrophic, but very disappointing. So we just don't know. Which is a big problem, because for most of the world, you really do need that growth. Among advanced countries, it's not just that we don't know. We actually, the best evidence, I would say, for countries that are advanced, and of course there's a selection bias there, but that nothing matters. If you look at output per person hour among the nations of Western Europe and North America and Japan a little bit off, but anyway, within the limits of measurement, it's all the same. We all have the same technology. We work different numbers of hours, but that's social choice, and so that isn't. But basically, in terms of what can move growth, we have no idea. In terms of inequality, like Janet said, we know. There's wide differences in the level of inequality among advanced countries. They're mostly explainable. The countries that do manage to achieve quite low levels of inequality don't appear to pay any severe economic penalty for it. If you look actually at this whole assault on socialism that's going on in the U.S. political domain, and you look at the stuff that's coming out of the usual sources, there are two things in the world that they really, really hate obsessively, one of which is AOC, and the other is Scandinavia. The Nordic countries clearly drive them crazy. They keep on coming. They can't make up their mind whether they actually really are capitalists after all, or whether in fact secretly they're suffering their socialist hellholes. But one way or another, Scandinavia really bothers them. But that's an indication that we actually do know a lot. On the question of relative, I would say it's not just relative poverty. There is particularly when we're talking about actual material deprivation, which is still a big issue for a lot of the world. But above a certain point, what we really, I think, care about is social inclusion, and we care about it both at the bottom and at the top, which is where I think the relative poverty doesn't quite get at everything I think matters. It certainly matters if people don't have enough income, disposable income, don't have the ability to feel that they are are full participants in the society, and that's always a moving standard. You know, Adam Smith said the definition of poverty was not being able to afford one good linen shirt. Right, that's 18th century England, but that's and obviously it's a lot higher than that now in contemporary OECD. But there's also social exclusion at the top. If you have levels of inequality where a significant group of people are living in a different universe from the rest, then that starts to erode as well. I've been looking lately at private schooling. Non-sectarian, we always had a lot of people in Catholic schools in the US, but non-sectarian private schooling used to be almost non-existent. There was a tiny, tiny elite that sent their kids to the famous boarding schools. But aside from that, it just didn't happen. Now, at the 90th percentile, it's gone from essentially nothing to about 6%. I'm sure that at the 95th, the 98th percentile, it's well above. So we now have a large part of the influential elite in the United States that has simply opted out of public schooling. That has to be really bad for social cohesion. And so those are the sorts of things I think that you really want to worry about on inequality, beyond just adequacy of material standard of living. Are we a society or are we not? And increasingly here we are not.
Thank you, Paul. And I was intrigued by this question of relative poverty that we have described in different ways. And it goes back a little bit to what I cited somebody as commenting on, is inequality the real issue over which people get upset, or is it the inability to access fundamental things that I consider to be essential and therefore fair, that my country, my society, my government provides me with access to? Because if it was just relative poverty, we would essentially be saying it's all a matter of jealousy. Once you get too much of something, I just don't like you anymore, I don't like the system anymore. And there was a public opinion poll recently that interrogated this question: do people object to Bill Gates being a billionaire? Absolutely not. They actually admire the garage phenomenon. What they object to is that on the basis of a success that in part is built on education, public grants, you remember the state as an entrepreneurial investor, I mean, that Mariana Mazzucato speaks about a lot in her analysis nowadays. There is this perception that at a certain point the thing becomes unfair because, first of all, you're not repaying society, which enabled you to get there, even though your own ingenuity was a key driver, but also the sheer size of your business, the dominance of a market becomes suddenly a multiplier. And therein lies one of those debates of our time, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it would be, people don't know enough, but it would be interesting to ask people, does it bother you that Sheldon Adelson is a billionaire? Does it bother you that the Sacklers, who made their fortune on opioids, are billionaires? I suspect you get a very different answer.
True. Then there are things that, you know, at one point were considered an asset and are now considered a liability in society. It may be asbestos, it may be cigarettes, it may be alcohol, it may be drugs, weapons, whatever. That's another dimension. But that's probably more an ethic debate rather than an inequality dimension. So I think clearly we are in a phase where most people in the world today are no longer living in extreme poverty. Therefore, the debate about inequality has shifted from absolutes to also relatives. No, but
there is a lot of vulnerability. Yeah, this is stay there. But
I'm only saying, if you take the last 300 years and you look from where humanity lived in relative terms, then I don't know how accurate the statistic is, but 300 years ago, 9 out of 10 people alive lived in extreme poverty.
We need our colleague Branko Milanovic.
I know, but
there is that part, and there is that part. There's also that part.
Yeah, but Branko would not contest the fact that in absolute terms, poverty, not inequality, poverty in the extreme definition actually is, in the last 200 to 300 years, a remarkable, or poverty eradication, a remarkable success story. Yeah. It used to be 9 out of 10 living in extreme poverty. Today it's 1 out of 10. Now we're 7 billion. We have 1 billion who are living in poverty, and well over 1 billion who cannot even consider themselves food secure. I'm just saying there are elements that also redefine the debates in different societies. But I wanted to end a little bit because part of our subtitle also was, are there good stories that tell us that actually policy design, policy interventions work. And I just took a quick set down just to remind ourselves that we have a rich history in which to learn how we address poverty and inequality. The New Deal we were talking about, the Bolsa Familia in Brazil, the social market economy, post-war Germany, collective bargaining, all those elements that created, in a sense, a market economy, but always with design elements been built into it to avoid extreme wealth, extreme poverty being a product of it. Norway, fascinating, as a society in 1910 passing a law that if you built a dam, then 10% of the revenue of that dam was by law to be given to the community in which that dam was built. We still are building dams today where most of the people affected by the dam are worse off at the end of that dam being constructed. People living downstream, people being resettled. It's extraordinary. And yet here was a country in 1910 that made it a law, equity, designed into a infrastructure project licensing process. The UK, the National Health Service, and the most phenomenal introduction post-war that to this day, across all parties, is a key element of at least addressing inequity in access to health services. South Africa's constitution and water policy legislation, introducing the right to water, the first 25 liters of water that any South African citizen has access to through the municipality is free. It's your right to live. And from there on, you get charged progressively. And if you run a swimming pool, yes, you pay 10 times more at the end of the day for a liter of water than the person who only uses 100 liters. Great examples. India's Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. And I want to end on Bhutan. Just 2 weeks ago, I visited Bhutan. Gross national happiness. Many of you will have come across it. A lot of people laughed about it. The Economist thought it was amusing 15 years ago. Today, Bhutan has its planning ministry baptized as the Gross National Happiness Ministry. It has designed a way of measuring development through 9 domains. It actually begins to apply them in the selection of projects and where it invests. And it is a society that deliberately is driving development investments in a way to manage not becoming more unequal, and yet even they are struggling to some extent with it. I think these are just a few examples that we already have in history, plenty of examples of how governments, societies choose to address on a scalable level, not as a social welfare program, but as a public policy design, as an economic DNA, policies that address inequality. And it brings me back, and with this I want to close our discussion this afternoon, to the moment when the Human Development Report was born. Remember Amartya Sen, the freedom from want? I want to end by postulating that the value of having a Human Development Index in the future is not only defined by what we're now testing, which is beyond income, beyond averages, beyond today, not only looking at the financial and wealth indication, but also the environmental resource dimensions, but ultimately the freedom to choose. Because if you don't have the freedom to choose, then inequality becomes an imprisonment. And development is, in many respects, meant to free people from poverty, from economic vulnerability, from environmental risks, and so on. And it is in that, let's say, articulation of a development index, which in turn allows us to stress test policies that in future we will pass. We hope that we can help to contribute to a more forward-looking and empowered public discourse around development pathways and choices that will allow us to actually say we are reducing inequality, we are reducing the unfairness of development outcomes that people are reacting to, and we're actually making development more sustainable, to put it in our UN-esque kind of narrative. Paul, dear panel members, may I thank you for having found time to be with us here today to share some of your insights from your journeys as academics, as professionals, as citizens of your countries also. I tested a little bit on both ends your views. And an invitation to all of you to please accompany us, hopefully in the coming year or two, as Pedro and his team leading the Human Development Report Office take us to a new level of articulating development options and choices. This is what motivates us to engage in these discussions, and it is a very clear purpose that stands behind this. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Have a good afternoon.